There's this point where he's arriving in New York on his way to the inauguration. And it's just the biggest party New York has ever seen. The streets are just choked with people. So many people that a carriage can't go through, requiring that Washington walk from the wharf in New York, the half mile to his residence through this absolutely packed crowd. And as he arrives at the wharf, the leader of the militia, that is to escort him, says, "Hi, I'm supposed to lead you, and I'm happy to follow you throughout your time here in New York." And Washington says, "No, the only guard I need is of the people that are here," and he points to the people.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this event in the series American Stories, Inspiration Today, presented by American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society, the Boston Public Library, Porter Square Books, and the GBH Forum Network. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of history and with the celebrated author, Nathaniel Philbrick. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event featuring his new book, Travels with George, in search of George Washington and his legacy.
I'm Kristen Motti, an adult programs librarian at the Central Library. Last November, Nathaniel Philbrick joined us for a virtual Baxter Lecture. We are so glad to be hosting Nat again for this evening's program, this conversation about his new book, Travels with George. Before we welcome Nat, here's just a little tiny bit about his work. Nathaniel Philbrick is an American author and a winner of the National Book Award for his maritime history, In the Heart of the Sea, The Tragedy of the Whale Ship Essex. He has written several books and many with a focus on sailing. His writing has also appeared in many notable publications, including Vanity Fair, the Wall Street Journal, and the Boston Globe. Nat is the director of the Egan Institute of Maritime Studies and is a research fellow at the Nantucket Historical Association. Travels with George, the topic of this evening, debuts on October 3rd on the New York Times bestseller list. Congratulations, Nat. To introduce this evening's moderator, Margaret, back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. Tonight's moderator and conversation partner is back by popular demand. As many of you know, Ryan J. Woods and Nat have been in dialogue before. Ryan is Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society. A dedicated researcher, Ryan has authored pedagogical studies about the use of historical biographies to teach character and ethics. He's also contributed genealogical articles and several book forwards for historical and genealogical publications. He regularly presents at conferences and events. Most important for tonight, he and Nathaniel Philbrick have wise and informative conversations. So we're all looking forward to that. And we're going to be hearing from both of them soon. But for now, Nat, it is such an honor to have you here in our humble series with your new book, which I really loved reading. I enjoyed every line, every page. You've used the term history nerds in that book and maybe elsewhere to describe yourself and folks like us, those of us who care enormously about the past and its representation. Nat, in this regard, in the realm of history nerds, you are our rock star, truly and entirely, to use a word David Sandberg and I use a lot. Authors are our rock stars, and you're the king, Nat. So to get us started tonight, I hope you'll tell all of us a bit about Travels with George. Go ahead, over to you.
Yes, well, it is such a pleasure to be talking to all of you about my new book, Travels with George. The organizations involved in this are my favorite. So it's really great to be in Boston, virtually, if nothing else, and to talk about Travels with George, a book that my wife, Melissa, and I, and our dog, Dora, spent a year and a half following Washington's travels as president when he was attempting to unify the country. I felt that in this time of unprecedented political divisions, it might be instructive to get a historical perspective on when Washington tried to pull this country together at the very beginning of our history. And now I think I'd like to show a few images from that were taken during our travels, some of which appear in the book. And here is a wonderful N.C. Wyeth painting of George Washington riding into Trenton, New Jersey on his giant white horse. It's just a terrific painting. It was originally a mural in a bank in Trenton. And you see the women of Trenton throwing rose petals in front of Washington as he enters the town. Trenton had served a large part in the Revolution, and so he returned to a place he was very familiar with, and so this was a great one. Now we'll go to the next one. Now this is another painting by N.C. Wyeth. When N.C. Wyeth was installing that painting you just saw up on the ceiling of this bank in Trenton, he was up on a scaffolding 30 feet up in the air, and he slipped and almost fell to his death. The experience haunted it, and that night he had a dream. He had a dream of what you see here in this painting, of dreaming about George Washington. He dreamed that he was on that scaffolding and saw Washington appear on his white horse and explain to him the Battle of Brandywine, where N.C. Wyeth happened to live. And you can see around him the battle unfolding. And on the left side of the painting, you can see Wyeth's son, Jamie, with their dog, sketching. It's just a wonderful, surreal type of painting that has become my favorite, and speaks so much to the often surreal nature of our travels with George. Now the next one. This is, as I said earlier, one of our traveling companions was Dora. John Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie, in which he traveled the country with a standard poodle by that name, was an inspiration for this book. And so we took along our Nova Scotia duck tolling retriever, Dora. You see here, who was just a year old when we set out. We were here driving down a very remote dirt road, the very same road Washington rode in a horse-drawn carriage more than 230 years ago, and that's Dora in the rear view. And now to our final slide. This is how it ended, with Melissa, Dora, and I in our white carriage, which was very suitable because for his southern tour, he had a special carriage built that was cream colored. And here we are on a historical tour of Philadelphia at the corner of Chestnut and Fifth in our own horse-drawn carriage. It was a real culminating experience for us, and that's how it all ended. And with that those visuals as a appetizer, let me now turn it over to Ryan Woods, and the event will truly begin. Thank you.
Hello, Nat. It's so nice to be with you this evening. I am certainly looking forward to our conversation about travels with George and relaying some of the insightful questions from our many, many audience members. By my count, this is at least your 13th full-length book. It is in some ways a significant departure from earlier works in terms of style and structure, and yet in many other ways it contains the substance and analysis that has made you amongst the country's most influential and best-selling history writers for more than 20 years. You've noted that you are interested in struggle and the edges of history. You've now spent much of the past decade researching and writing about the American Revolution and, by extension, George Washington. And that has been done primarily through your award-winning trilogy that includes Bunker Hill, A City, a Siege, and a Revolution in 2013, Valiant Ambition, George Washington, Benedict Arnold, and the Fate of the American Revolution in 2016, and In the Hurricane's Eye, The Genius of George Washington and the Victory at Yorktown in 2018, and now Travels with George. So after spending so much time, relatively speaking, with Washington through the trilogy, what were you hoping to learn and accomplish with this particular look at our first president?
Yeah, well, after finishing my third book about the Revolution, I was done with war. I had no more bloodshed. I just needed to move on, and I needed a change of pace. I live on Nantucket, 30 miles out to sea. It's all of 14 miles long. If you want to go on a road trip on Nantucket, you find yourself going around and around like a hamster on a wheel. And I just wanted to get out of my office and see the country I'd been writing about for all these years. And as I referred to earlier, Travel with Charlie is one of my favorite books, and that was it's always been an inspirational book for me. And yet, even though I was done with war for the time being, I was not done with George Washington. I never saw my Washington fixation coming. But after spending 10 years with him, I just needed to find out what happened to him next. But I also just needed to change it up. And it was during a research trip in the late innings of working on in the hurricane's eye that I was in Providence, and I went to the John Brown House. This is not John Brown, the abolitionist. This is John Brown, one of the founders of Brown University, and actually a slave trader at one point in his career, and who revered George Washington. And in the back of the John Brown House, owned by the Rhode Island Historical Society, is John Brown's chariot. And according to family tradition, Brown took Washington on a ride when he was visiting Providence as president. And I said, why was Washington, newly inaugurated president in 1790, what was he doing in Providence? And that led me to discover that when he became president, he realized, he was the leader of 13 disunited states. He needed to do something. So he went on this series of road trips. And with the example of Steinbeck before me, I thought, well, what if I retraced that journey? And what if I brought along my wife, Melissa? She had just retired from her second career. She was a former attorney, but from her second career as the leader of a nonprofit on Nantucket. So suddenly she had some time available. We just had gotten this new puppy named Dora. What if we did our Steinbeck thing and followed George Washington at this time of great political divisiveness? What would it be like to examine what it was like following Washington, trying to unite the country? And so off we went. For me, I knew from the beginning, every book I try to do something different in a narrative way. And this one, it was going to be two journeys. It was going to be ours and it was going to be Washington. And the trick was going to be to interweave the two. And that really excited me. It was going to be a very different kind of book to write. I wanted to use a much more informal voice. I wanted this to be, you're kind of in the back seat with me as I tell you about our journey, or listening to Melissa and I have an argument or whatever happens during all this. And so this is what it is. So for me, I think it's dangerous to take the past too seriously. And so with this book, I wanted to have some fun with it while not shying away from the darker edges of what Washington and the country were experiencing at this time.
So how did you go about planning the trip? What were your sources for understanding what this journey would entail?
Yeah, well, there's quite a bit of information. Washington actually kept a diary during this tour, which is a treasure trove. Not that he would say anything tremendously confessional or fascinating, but it was a blow-by-blow description of where he went. And it was a good thing there was no TripAdvisor in 1789, because he stayed only in public taverns, and he didn't. This was a time when public taverns were not the B&Bs with waffles in the morning that we enjoy today. These were the Motel 6s of his day. Not that Motel 6s are bad, but it was basic accommodations. And so Washington didn't always enjoy that, but he wanted to make a point. And so, but we knew where he had gone, and this has been published and edited, and there's all sorts of great notes about it. There have been books written about this, which are very helpful. But I also, in the beginning, made a list of all the towns he visited, and more than 100 of them, because I didn't want to just see Washington's perspective. I wanted to know what memories that were still alive in the towns he visited. I wanted, what were the first-hand person accounts of his visit. So I reached out to the historical societies and libraries of as many of these towns as I could, which was quite an undertaking. And we did this even before we left. And I tell you, it was just the outpouring was amazing. And soon I was receiving journals, letters, pages from 19th century local histories that had information about it. And so so this was a tremendous influx of information. Tip O'Neill said that all politics is local. This was, I'm now very much convinced all history is local. This was, gave a fascinating view of the arrival of the president on a local level. And so with all of this together, we then began to plan our itinerary. There were basically 5 legs to this. And we broke it all up, and Melissa's the organized one in the family. So she created a spreadsheet, which became very complex. Because many of the people I had contacted had volunteered to get in our Honda Pilot with us and show us around. So we had to schedule each one of these visits. We had to find dog-friendly accommodations, which was sometimes not that easy. But it was it took us a year and a half. We didn't do it all at once. We have 2 fathers who are still with us in their 90s. We needed to check in where they live independently on the Cape. We wanted to check in with them regularly, with children in the Brooklyn area, along with grandchildren, all that. But we then set out, and I have to say, it was really the adventure of a lifetime for all 3 of us, I think. Dora seemed to enjoy herself. And it was just a fascinating way to get into the history of this really unique endeavor that Washington set out to accomplish.
Could you say something about Washington's aims as he set out on these various tours over the first years of his presidency? What was he looking to accomplish?
Yeah, well, America in 1789 was already divided, I hate to say. I mean, the Constitution had deeply divided the country into what were known as Federalists, those who supported the Constitution and the strong national government it created, and Anti-Federalists. These weren't organized parties, but they were parties in embryo. And the Anti-Federalists distrusted the strong national government created by the Constitution and believed the states should retain more of the power they had originally had under the Articles of Confederation. And so Washington had to sell this to people. When he was inaugurated, two of the 13 states had not yet ratified the Constitution, North Carolina and, of course, Rhode Island, and that prodigal state. And so he had a work set out for him. And then there was the deep-seated local loyalties. When a Virginian said "my country," he or she meant Virginia. They did not mean the United States of America. Washington had to go out there, and this was before mass media, before you could turn on your TV and see the president and he could speak to you. He had to go out there and visit as many of the villages and towns and cities as he could, and show people that there was something now more than their town and their state. There was now the United States of America, and he was their new leader.
As you set the stage for the first leg of the tour, this is the travel from Mount Vernon to New York before the inauguration. You paint a picture of Washington, who is not exactly the father of our country, though he'd been unanimously elected. There is a lot of internal reflection occurring at this time, a bit of unsureness about the duties that lay before him. Could you speak to Washington's mindset as he took the first leg of this tour to New York, and even the development of his first inaugural address and what he was trying to accomplish, both from the trip and from a public perspective as he made his way to New York?
Yeah, Washington was the most reluctant president we have ever had. he really did not want to be president of the United States. And as demonstrated in his diary and in the letters he would write to friends, his fear was, yes, he had managed miracles during the revolution, and people, revered him. He was the most popular man in the world at this time. And his great fear was that by becoming president and undertaking what he realized was a much harder job, because never before in the history of a revolution had there been a successful pivot from the revolution to a republic, to a democracy. They always ended up a dictator taking power or a monarch returning to power. And so he was very concerned about this and feared he was about to lose everything he had achieved when it came to his stature in America. And he could see the divisions nascent within the nation, and knew, yes, he was very popular now. The only reason the Constitution was ultimately ratified by all 13 states, some have argued, was because they could agree on one thing, at least, that only Washington could be that first president. So there was a huge amount of pressure on him. And so he was someone who had not gotten the formal education that so many of the founding fathers had, and he had deep sense of his inadequacies. And I think this is a surprise to a lot of people. I mean, there's a tendency, since we now know how it ended up, there's a tendency to see him as that marble man, that man who knew exactly what he wanted to achieve and achieved it. When he got to New York for his inauguration, it was in Federal Hall. There still is a Federal Hall. It's not the same building, but it's on the same foundation. And there's actually a statue of Washington taking the oath in front. It's a wonderful building, and every April 30th they have a reenactment of the inaugural, which is described in my book. And so Washington was sworn in on the second floor balcony of Federal Hall. And I think when we see the inauguration of a president today, we see someone trying to do their best imitation of what we think was Washington's inauguration, looking forceful, into the future and ready to meet any challenge that is going to be thrown at them. In reality, Washington did not have this demeanor when he took the oath of office, thanks to a girl named Eliza, who was just 15 years old and on a porch across the street from, actually on the roof of a house across the street from this balcony where Washington was about to take his oath of office. We have our account of it. And according to Eliza, Washington, as he stepped up to take his oath, was suddenly overcome and staggered back and fell into a chair, an unscripted move. She said that the crowd quickly realized he had been overcome by the moment, by what was before him. And then he would be sworn in, and then we have a senator's account of Washington reading his inaugural address. Now, in the months prior to Washington's inauguration, he had written a first draft with the help of one of his aides of his inaugural address. It went on for 70 pages, and detailed in agonizing detail all his anxieties about how he feared people would think he was doing this to enrich himself, how he feared people would say he was, playing favorites, all this kind of thing. And he luckily he gave it to James Madison, a Virginia congressman, to take a look at. And he said, no, this is not what you need to do. Madison even lent his hand to a much shorter address, which is what Washington thankfully would ultimately deliver. But when he was delivering it, the state senator said he was showing all the fear he never betrayed before the leveled cannon during the Revolution. He was quivering, shaking like a leaf, stumbling over the words of speech he had rehearsed countless times. He was scared when he set out on this. And once again, this is a different kind of Washington. Yeah, as I say in the book, to be haunted by the past is bad enough. To be the first, to be especially the precedent-setting first president of the United States, is to know the unbearable weight of the future. And Washington was feeling it.
So after the inaugural tour from Mount Vernon to New York, there were essentially 4 more legs of this. Could you speak to how Washington organized his travels, and to the extent known, what were the different purposes of those 4 legs?
Yeah, so it sort of began within just a few weeks of Washington's presidency. He sent a letter to his cabinet, John Adams and the others, and his cabinet was still being formed. He didn't have a Secretary of State yet. Alexander Hamilton would be part of it, but it hadn't happened yet. It was all just embryonic at this stage. But it said, when Congress goes into recess in the fall, what if I go on a tour of New England? He realized that there was a real danger of him becoming isolated in office. What if I go on a tour of New England to talk to people, to learn about their concerns about the government, so that I can learn about the people it is now my job to serve? And so that idea sounded good to his cabinet. One of the cabinet members made the point, well, if you're going to go to New England, you're also going to have to tour the South, which would clearly seemed just fine by Washington. And so come October, not even 6 months into his presidency, he set out on a tour of New England, and the way he set out from New York, which was the temporary capital, headed up to Rye, New York was his first stop, and remember, he could only travel. He was on a horse-drawn carriage, 4 horses, entourage of only a little more than half a dozen people. 2 of them were his enslaved servants, Giles and Paris. He was accompanied by his secretary, Tobias Lear, originally from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and they had a baggage wagon, and off they went. And so they would go, in these 40-mile intervals. Word of his route, which would take him to New Haven, and then up to Hartford, to Springfield, and then through Worcester to Boston, and ultimately to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, before turning back and heading back. And word of his approach were trumpeted far and wide, and people began to gather, particularly at the crossroads and along the way, and it became quite an event.
Throughout the travels, you remark on a recurring theme of Washington's tours, which related how he wanted to be seen, and that was both seemingly real, aspirational, and it was also belied by the receptions that he received, and even how he's largely remembered today. And that is to say that he wanted to be seen as, quote, only a man. Why do you think that was so important to Washington and to the people who recounted his visits?
Yeah, and it's one of those traditions that kept cropping up in my research, where anecdotes about either children or himself saying, look, I may be president, but I am only a man. And, at first I thought, this sounds a little too good to be true. I mean, is he really saying this? But no, I mean, over and over again, it's not, and even in the Southern tour, you see it. I think he really was saying a version of this. I mean, his point was everyone feared that Washington, the general, could use his celebrity to become another monarch. And so particularly the Anti-Federalists, this was their great fear. And Washington, when you looked at him, was a living embodiment of that fear. And so he had to be very careful. He had to, and yet he wanted to use his great personal charisma. Hey, he looked great on a horse. He was 6'2" 6'4" tall. After 8 years as commander of the Continental Army, he knew how to make an impression. And when he was going into a larger town or city, he would get out of his carriage before he entered the town limits, dressed in his general's uniform, with those gold epaulets on his shoulders, mount his great big white horse, and ride down Main Street to thunderous acclaim. Now, you might interpret this as the living nightmare of an anti-federalist, and it was to one extent. But Washington was determined to use his great personal charisma, magnetism, if you want to call it that, and popularity, not to turn himself into the dictator people feared, but to give legitimacy to the presidency. His great fear was who would follow him. He needed to establish a sense that the president of the United States had some gravitas, that was the leader of a country, not just one or two states, but of a country of 13 states. And so he was willing to pull out the stops with a grand theatrical touch, if it delivered that point. And yet he needed to manage that. And so I think this recurring statement, "I am only a man," was designed to do that. Another way he tried to do that was by staying only in public taverns. He very easily could have said, "Well, I'm going to stay in the nice houses of my rich friends." He made a point not to do that, and suffered the consequences. But it was part of the storyline. Yes, I won the revolution. I was a great general, but now I am the president, and I am one of you. I am only a man.
You spoke of the Anti-Federalists, and even in the time of Washington, and certainly it's more well understood now, that there was Anti-Federalist sentiment fomenting even within his cabinet as he was on these tours. Could you speak to some of the Anti-Federalist activities that took place as Washington was traveling the country, and who was at the center of those activities?
Yeah, well, it was occurring in his own cabinet. Thomas Jefferson, who became Secretary of State in March of the year following his Washington's inauguration, distrusted, did not like Alexander Hamilton, who he felt was way too into the British model of things, felt he was trying to transplant a virtual monarchy on America. Jefferson had been our minister to France, saw the French model with all that increasing revolutionary fervor as more appropriate to what America was all about. And so he began to really fear that Washington's popularity, his policies in which he used the strong federal government to create a tax plan. Remember, these were 13 states that had rebelled against England over the issue of taxation. But if this country was going to work, they needed to tax the people. The federal government needed to do that, which had never occurred before. It had always been only through the states. And so Jefferson was increasingly at odds with Hamilton. And this was beginning to occur while Washington was on the final leg of his tours during his Southern tour, the longest, most ambitious tour. It took 3 months. He traveled almost 3,000 miles. And while he was finishing up the Southern tour, Jefferson and his buddy, James Madison, who by this time had become increasingly disaffected with Washington's and Hamilton's policies, they went on a tour of their own, a northern tour to Vermont, which was a new state. And in a rather disingenuous letter to Washington, Jefferson, he said he was doing it for his health. He needed to get away. But as would be later revealed, he spent much of this tour meeting with the emerging political opposition. And Aaron Burr, for example, in New York, who had just unseated Hamilton's father-in-law to become senator of New York. And they began organizing what would become the opposition party, the Republican Party, or often called the Democratic Republican Party, and in the process invent the two-party system that we have today. And so it was as Washington, even so partisanship is nothing new. Not even Washington could stem the tide of the political divisions that were represented by his own Secretary of State. And so, I think this adds a kind of poignancy to the story of Washington's journey. Here I think he was tremendously successful. We're a country today because of these series of journeys where, today we may be from Massachusetts or whatever, but we're Americans, no matter how recently we've come to this country. And that's because Washington set out on this group of tours and virtually created the government that is now continues to run this country. And yet, not even he could stem this tide. And by the end of his second term as president, he was deeply frustrated and angry about the partisan divide that had taken over the country. And so this, for me, this provided a kind of personal tale of not woe exactly, but this is not the Washington we think of. This was not Washington achieving everything and feeling great about it. This was Washington never having that high five moment, never feeling like, yes, I did it, because already as he was trying to unite the country, it was being undercut.
In the preface to Travels with George, you note that you like to probe at the dark edges of history. And surely there is no darker and more complicated matter in American history than slavery. And certainly no credible history of Washington could gloss over the issue of slavery. But I'm struck by the number of examples demonstrating just how much Washington thought about and struggled with the matter of slavery, both on a personal and political level, as told through Travels with George. Were you surprised by what you encountered?
Well, yes and no. I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to do this book was I wanted to explore the slavery issue. Even we took this before the pandemic, before the death of George Floyd and the extraordinary movement for social justice. And I was writing the book during all that, and which suddenly, but all those issues were nascent when we were doing it, and this gave a real urgency. It was to writing this book. Sometimes it felt like it was a red hot vector pointed at the heart of America, and so I wanted slavery. I had to be a part of this, and I wanted to use his travels as a way to get at that side of him and get at that side of the story. And you're right, it was an issue, and I was surprised. I was surprised at how he struggled personally with it. He by the end of the Revolution, he had begun to realize that slavery, that slavery could not go on and have a strong union. He could see that, and yet he had become a slave owner at age 11 when his father died, and he inherited several enslaved workers. And on his estate, there were 300 enslaved workers. About half of them were owned by Washington. The other half were owned by the estate of Martha's dead husband. That would then be willed to the next generation. And they had intermarried. So it was a very complicated situation at Mount Vernon. And Washington aspired to free his own enslaved people, but it would be a very complicated thing since the families had intermarried. And I found his personal, labors in this to really reflect in many ways our own tangled relationship to America's past. And so for me, this had to be a really important part of this journey, because it was the only way to do justice to the darkness that is at the edge of America.
We'll turn in just a moment to questions from our audience, but on the issue of slavery, you note that Washington admitted, quote, the unfortunate condition of the persons whose labor I employ has been the only unavoidable subject of regret. Slavery was, to say again clearly, a matter about which Washington thought deeply and seemed to have a sense of his ethical and moral obligation. And yet there are documented examples, even after he was president, of belying his own convictions to take deliberate action to capture or deny legally afforded emancipation to people he enslaved. Could you say just a word or two about the stories of, say, Ona Judd and Washington's chef Hercules Posey, and shed some light on those figures and their experiences in this juxtaposition of moral obligation and yet action in his own life?
Yeah, well, the example of Ona Judd is, I think, really gets it to the heart of the bad stuff in Washington. She was part of, she was Martha's enslaved house servant, and was with her daily. And when the temporary capital of the country moved from New York to Philadelphia, she took the opportunity to escape and get on a schooner that ultimately took her to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where she ultimately married and had several children. And Martha was very upset by this, and at her urging, Washington put in an ad describing Ona Judd, and it would ultimately, he would learn that someone who knew Washington and recognized her, saw her on the streets of Portsmouth. And so Washington used the power of the presidency to reach out to a government official in Portsmouth to try to get his help in bringing Ona back. To the credit of those in Portsmouth, he did not assist Washington. He interviewed Ona and reported that Ona had not been secreted away by someone else, which was Martha and Washington's conviction. She had simply gone in search of freedom. And so Washington was stymied in this regard, and yet just before he died, he tried once again, sending a cousin of Martha's, a nephew of Martha's, to back to Portsmouth. It was once again unsuccessful. But how do you reconcile this with Washington, who at the same time has written a new will in which he frees his enslaved workers upon his death? And this human personalities are not always consistent and rational in these kinds of things. And when it came to Hercules, who was the famous chef in the presidential mansion in Philadelphia and back at Mount Vernon, he would escape on, and I think it was not by any accident, on the day of Washington's birthday, and eventually make his way, it seems, to New York. And once again, and when Hercules's daughter was asked by a guest to Mount Vernon if she was sad that her father had left, she said no, because now he is free. And so I think these are very important examples to have before us when we evaluate Washington's ultimate legacy. Yes, he was a unifier. He believed with all his soul in the Union, which would be the principle that would ultimately lead Abraham Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And yet, not even Washington could completely leave behind the preconceptions with which he grew up. And and I think it speaks to the tangled legacy of our nation and slavery.
Turning to questions from our audience, Martha is looming large on the minds of our guests this evening. Did your research or travels show anything about Martha's influence on Washington? Did she ever accompany him on any of these travels?
Yeah, well, Martha is a big character in this book. Melissa particularly was interested. At one point, while we're following Washington in New England, Melissa said, "So, what was Martha doing?" during all this. And by this time, the Washingtons had adopted the youngest two children of Martha's deceased son. They were 8 years old and 11 years old, and they were part of the presidential household. And so Martha stayed home with the kids while Washington went on these tours. But as her letters reveal to her niece and to a friend in the Boston area, she wasn't happy back home, particularly in the first year of the presidency. She did not want Washington to become president. And both of them had really hoped that they could spend the rest of their lives at Mount Vernon. And so, you know, she was not, she said, I feel like a prisoner here. And so and that she, you know, she would get angry and not go out. But she also said, hey, they're trying to, Washington and his staff are trying to do everything they can for me. If I was a younger person, I would probably enjoy the pageantry that goes with being, you know, the first lady, but, you know, she just wasn't enjoying it. And she and Washington had a very close relationship during the Revolution. She had visited him every winter. In fact, it's been estimated about half the time of the Revolution they spent together, which is pretty extraordinary given the amount she had to travel. And, you know, and I just wish we had the letters between them. They were, Martha burned them upon Washington's death. But, you know, Washington was constantly writing to Martha during the Revolution and during this journey. So, you know, we have references to those letters, and if we could have only had that information. I think Washington really enjoyed the company of women, you know, intellectually. And at parties, he often sort of left the men alone and hung out with the women because he just enjoyed that kind of conversation, which is interesting. And so Martha was it was a real marriage, and so you know, it added a counterpoint to Washington's travels.
Another question that is recurring on the minds of the audience this evening, thinking about the logistics of Washington's tours, was there any sort of organized security associated with these? Do we have a sense from Washington's diaries that he was ever afraid or looking for protection as he traveled about in these regions? In some cases, in places that he had actually never been. One of the things, frankly, I was surprised to learn personally was that he had relatively little experience in the South. He had never been to Georgia or South Carolina before he was president, for example. So if you could speak to, again, the logistics of this and notions of security or protection on these legs of the tour.
Oh, it's a great question. And I think, you know, considering where we are now when it comes to the security of the president, it's almost unimaginable. You know, there really was no security detail. And there's this point where he's arriving in New York on his way to the inauguration. And it's just the biggest party New York has ever seen. The streets are just choked with people. So many people that a carriage can't go through, requiring that Washington walk from the wharf in New York, the half mile to his residence through this absolutely packed crowd. And as he arrives at the wharf, the leader of the militia that is to escort him, you know, says, "Hi, I'm supposed to lead you, and I'm happy to follow you throughout your time here in New York." And Washington says, "No, you know, the only guard I need is of the people that are here," and he points to the people, you know, and there's, you know, really no concern voiced about his public safety. But you're right, when it came to the Southern journey, there were legitimate reasons to be concerned. By that point, Hamilton's economic policies, which involved a tax on whiskey, had come into clear and controversial focus. And there were many Southerners who voiced their displeasure with the law. In fact, the former governor of North Carolina, Wiley Jones, let it be known that he would be honored to shake the hand of General Washington, but he would not allow President Washington into his house. And so he was going into terra incognita. And this time he had with him a aide, William Jackson, who had served in the American Revolution, and was a soldier by training. And so Jackson was about as close to a security detail as Washington had. There really was no attempt to concern in that regard, and which is just absolutely staggering when we know what is involved today in keeping the president safe.
Were there any surprises in your research and travels, something that you were really shocked to learn about Washington, to the extent that we're able to get a sense of his mindset or feelings? Not to reveal too much, but I think one of the important moments of the book is when Melissa says, after all this time, Washington in some ways is still a mystery. Yeah. And so given that much of his inner life is sort of shrouded from us, was there anything you were surprised to learn?
Yeah, well, Steinbeck says, we do not take a trip takes us. And unexpected events happened all the time in our journey. It's the best part. It was the best part of it from our perspective. But what really surprised, we all think of Washington as the guy on the $1 bill, that sort of marble man staring at us. And what we kept seeing were examples of Washington, not the statesman or the general or the plantation owner, but Washington, the traveler, the human being. One of the ones that really struck me was in Oyster Bay, Long Island, when Washington went on a tour of the western end of Long Island to thank the people who had served as his spies in the Culper Spy Ring during the Revolution. It was all under the radar. There's absolutely no mention of this tour in any of the newspapers of the day, which is really kind of amazing. And thanks to the testimony of a woman who at 8 years old was standing at the gate in front of her house in Oyster Bay, we have her account of seeing Washington ride by on his horse, and across the street from this girl Sarah's house, they were some workmen building a one-room schoolhouse. And they were about to put one of the rafters up on the roof. Now, remember, Washington was a tall man. Well, Washington sees this, stops his horse, gets off the horse, and volunteers to help him. And so he and the workmen lift this rafter up onto the roof, and then there's this great cheer. And this is not the Washington from the $1 bill. This is a Washington who's kind of enjoying this, getting out, rolling up his sleeves, and helping build a one-room schoolhouse. And if you're in Oyster Bay today, there is a plaque. It's near the Episcopal Church in Oyster Bay now, is the Bungtown one-room schoolhouse. And seeing that plaque, a local historian showed it to us. I mean, it's like standing in the vortex of history. Here, this is where it happened. Sarah must have been over there watching, and Sarah would recount this when she was in her 90s, living in Greenwich Village at the end of the 19th century. I mean, and there it is. And so that's the kind of example where this was a surprise. A, it was a surprise that Washington would do something like this, and then B, it was a surprise that our landscape, hidden in our landscape, really are these the roots of these kinds of events.
You began your travels following Washington's route in 2018, as you noted, and the level of social and political tension to come could not necessarily have been predicted, to say nothing of a pandemic. And yet it all seemingly aligns as the appropriate backdrop by which you examine Washington. And so I guess I have to conclude my portion of the evening by asking the big question you set out on. Does Washington still matter in America today?
Yes. Washington does matter. I mean, he was not perfect by any means. At one point in this book, I compare him to Captain Ahab in Moby Dick. He had his flaws, but this does not mean we turn our backs on someone who worked with so much dedication to creating something bigger than himself. The Union. There is the Constitution, and there is the Union, and there is the Declaration of Independence, and those are that trinity is absolutely central to who we are today. And so I think it's you cannot he is absolutely essential, and that does not mean he was absolutely perfect. And this holds true to anybody in the past. We cannot condemn completely people using the standards of today, because America is a country that's always in the midst of a revolution, as each generation redefines what it means that all of us are created equal.
Nat, as ever, it is a pleasure to speak with you. And I have 100 more questions, and there are another 100 from our audience. But I am going to turn the program over to my colleague again, Margaret Talcott.
Thank you, Ryan.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. I learned an enormous amount, and your travelogue meets history is really engaging. We're getting a lot of specific questions. Was he in this town or that town? And the book has such amazing maps, line drawings, photos, and a wonderful history of all of the regions. So I encourage all of you to look there. And I answered as many of you as I could, referencing the book. As we do for all our inspirational author events, we're going to ask Nat to share a reading from his book. So Nat, thank you for that question and answer, and back to you for the closing reading.
Okay, well, thank you, Margaret. Well, this is from a portion of the epilogue in which Melissa and I and Dora decided that after following George, we had to follow Jefferson and Madison as they departed on their northern tour of up to Vermont. And as it so happens, my brother Sam lives in Stowe, and we had actually spent our summers in Underhill, Vermont, on the other side of Mount Mansfield. And so we visited with my brother Sam and his wife Sue, and they took us to the summit of Mount Mansfield, and we looked out towards the Lake Champlain, which Jefferson and Madison had sailed up on their way to Burlington, which they never got to. But I will now take up where that leaves off. Standing on Mount Mansfield at the end of summer, I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness. Our travels with George had come to an end, just as the story of the new nation was beginning. Jefferson and Madison would return to Philadelphia and continue to organize the political resistance, confident they were battling the pernicious forces of monarchy and corruption. In the meantime, Hamilton and the Federalists, equally confident in their righteousness, pushed forward the financial programs on which today's economy, with all its excesses and inequalities, is built. In the middle was Washington, a Federalist for sure, but a Federalist who recognized there was another point of view. What bothered him were not the philosophical differences between his two warring cabinet members, but their unwillingness to work cooperatively. Differences in political opinions are as unavoidable as, to a certain point, they may perhaps be necessary, he wrote to Hamilton. When matters get to such lengths, the natural inference is that both sides have strained the cords beyond their bearing, and that a middle course would be found the best until experience shall have pointed out the right mode, or, which is not to be expected because it is denied to mortals, there shall be some infallible rule by which we could forejudge events. What both Hamilton and Jefferson needed, Washington seemed to be saying, was a little more humility and self-doubt, because no one, not even the two most brilliant men of their age, had all the answers. Unlike Hamilton and Jefferson, Washington didn't need to be right all the time. He just wanted to make things work. He understood that feasible change is not attained by righteous indignation. It's understanding that the road ahead is full of compromises if life is actually going to get better. Not Jefferson. When it came to his beloved French Revolution, he insisted that rather than it should have failed, I would have seen half the earth desolated. Were there but an Adam and Eve left in every country and left free, it would be better than it is now. This kind of philosophical dogmatism and melodrama was anathema to Washington. He had spent 8 years of his life doing his best to prevent the United States from succumbing to the divisions and violence that were about to consume France. He understood the darkness of self-interest lurking beneath the most high-minded ideals. And yet, despite his inherent skepticism concerning the human condition, he had an abiding faith in the American people. Although we may be a little wrong now and then, Washington wrote to his former aide-de-camp, Jonathan Trumbull Jr., we shall return to the right path with more avidity. Thomas Jefferson had written the Declaration of Independence, but it had been left to George Washington to translate its words into something real, into something that might one day evolve into what the preamble to the Constitution calls a more perfect union. By subsuming sectional and philosophical interests to the good of the whole, the Union is the antidote to arrogance and self-importance, because there will always be something bigger than a single person, town, city, state, or region, or any single race, religion, sexual orientation, or set of beliefs. The founders never claimed to have created the ideal political system, but no one over the course of the last 244 years has come up with a better form of government. The fact that we are in a position today to find fault with the past is a tribute to what was created by the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the labors of George Washington. If our country is ever going to improve in the future, we need to look the past full in the face today. And there at the very beginning is our first president, a slaveholder, a land baron, a general, and a politician who believed with all his soul in the Union. Thank you.
Thank you, Nat, so much. I love not just reading your books, but listening to you talk about them, because it always seems like you're talking about a group of old friends that you've spent all this time with over the years, which in a way you have. And as a fellow huge Moby Dick fan, as I know you are, you completely surprised me with the comparison to Ahab, which the more I thought about it, the more I liked, but it never would have occurred to me in the first place. So thank you for that. I want to remind everybody that if you want to not just get the book, but get the book signed by our author, you should use this coupon code when you order from Porter Square Books. There's the website is portersquarebooks.com, and just search for the book in the search bar. When you get to the book and you complete your order and it asks for a coupon code, just write AMINSP20, and that will be in at the end of next week to be signing the hundreds of thousands of books that we know he'll need to sign. So thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining us. I don't know who's talking after me, but we love having everyone here. We love being part of this series, and we hope you'll continue to support independent bookstores and wonderful authors.
Thank you, David. On behalf of the Boston Public Library, thank you, Nat. Thank you, Ryan, for that wonderful conversation.